Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I know we have many joining us today from all over the world, which is fabulous. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on leveraging EQ for better resilience. Today's webinar is hosted by Talent Smart EQ, and for those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a consulting firm specializing in emotional intelligence development, training, assessments, certification, and coaching. We've been in business for over 20 years now, and unlike other talent and development firms, everything that we do is centered around emotional intelligence, or EQ. My name is Madison, and I will be your host and technical producer today. Before I introduce my partner for today's webinar, I'd like to take care of just a few quick housekeeping items. On the left-hand side of your screen is where you should see your GoToWebinar panel, and that is where you can adjust your audio settings. Today's webinar will run for approximately 30 to 35 minutes of content, and then at the end we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A from the audience. The webinar will be recorded, and everyone will receive a recording to the email that they registered with about an hour after the webinar is finished. Additionally, on screen at the very end of the webinar, an automated feedback survey will appear for you. It's going to be about 5 simple questions with a rating of 1 to 5 and the ability to provide a comment about your experience or ask a question. We really appreciate that feedback at Talent Smart EQ, and we do read all of the responses. It helps to assure that we are continually creating content and providing webinars that are really helpful, insightful, and enjoyable and valuable. So please fill out that feedback survey. And lastly, as I mentioned, we will be holding a Q&A session at the end for anyone to ask questions. There's a question field in your GoToWebinar panel that's on the left side of your screen. So at any time during the webinar today, when you do have a question, feel free to type that in, and we'll circle back at the end and try to answer as many of those that we have time for. That wraps up our housekeeping items. So without further ado, I would love to introduce my partner for today's webinar, and we can jump in and get started. Oops. Okay, there we go. As I mentioned, I'm Madison, and I'll be taking a seat today to support while looking at your questions so we can have our speaker address them a bit later on. Joining us is David Brzezowski, Director of Training, who you should be able to see on this screen right now, and he will be our speaker and subject matter expert. I'm tuning in from San Diego, California, and David is on the eastern part of the US in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. David, why don't you go ahead and say hello to everyone?
Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here today, and I did want to call out Madison's new headshot. I love it, Madison.
Thank you, David. Why don't you go ahead and share with everyone what we're going to be discussing in today's webinar?
Absolutely. Well, like I said, I'm excited to be here today because we're going to be talking about something that I think so many of us talk about without maybe even using the word, and that is about how we leverage emotional intelligence for better resilience. I mean, let's face it, this world that we live in has kind of challenged us in many different aspects of our life, and many people, I think I keep hearing, just feel at a loss of how to be more resilient. So today, here's specifically what we're going to be talking about. So number one, we're going to make sure that we understand what we mean by talking about resilience. So what does it actually mean? Next up, we're going to identify 3 characteristics of resilient people, what they actually possess. The third thing we're going to get into is clarifying why resilience is an important skill to have. And I did mention that it's a skill, so that means that it is something that we can work on. So that's going to be our third aspect. And then the fourth thing that we're going to tackle today is several EQ strategies, 3 specifically, to cultivate a more resilient us. So specifically for you, how you can work on your resilience. And as Madison said, we will also go into some Q&A at the end of the session. So please, by all means, add your questions throughout the session into here as well. Thank you. With that, why don't we do a poll like we do at a lot of our webinars, Madison?
Absolutely, David. All right, so our poll is very simple, and we just want to ask everyone how they feel about their own resilience. So 1 is, I consider myself to be very resilient. 2, at times I can be resilient, but more consistency would be nice. And 3, I would not consider myself to be very resilient these days.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see what we got here with these people.
I'll give it a few more seconds here for people to answer before I share the results.
Perfect.
Okay.
Okay. So I can be resilient, but more consistency would be nice is overwhelming, which I'm glad to hear that, because at least we feel like we do have some resilience, and we probably have built that over time, especially these last few years as well. So definitely you are in the right place. For those 8% that said I would consider myself to be very resilient, perfect. I'd love it if you want to post something into the questionnaire about what you do. But with that, let's get started and let's start talking about what resilience is. I think that it's important that we at least get all on the same page. So I want to bring up this actual definition. So as we would describe resilience, and as you see on the screen here, we define it as the ability to bounce back from negative or challenging experiences. We put the picture of Malala on here because I think she's a great example of someone who has been so resilient. And when you really think about what Malala did, she used the energy of her emotions, if you will, to do good work. So she turned it into this very challenging and bad situation. And she has now gone on to do great things for not just young women around the globe, but really all women around the globe. And really for so many of us to look at her as an example of resilience. But there's another definition also that I found that is really made up of from psychologists. And they get a little bit deeper. And so here's what that particular definition says. And it goes a little deeper, saying that it's the process of adapting well in the face of several things: adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress. So think about that even deeper, as a meaning. And we think about the fact that, I pulled out when I was doing some research on resilience, two organizations kept coming up, one being the Paralympics and the other being the Invictus Games. And when I look at the Invictus Games, one of their messages talks about harnessing sport to inspire recovery. That is a way for those individuals who really truly need to be resilient to put it into a much more positive way to move forward. But I think that everybody pretty much agrees when you look at a lot of research that's out there, experts and psychologists alike, they all say that there's one thing, that resilience can be taught and it can be learned. And that's a win for us whenever we're feeling like maybe we're not as resilient as we would really like to be. So, but what does resilience actually look like? And I would like you to think about in yourself, what does it look like? So that first question that we asked in the poll was great, but let's start talking a little bit about what it can do and look like in us. So there's several characteristics of resilient people, and this comes from several different studies that are out there that says, here is what we have found that resilience looks like in people. So the first characteristic is acceptance. So let me talk a little bit about acceptance. It's that resilient people have this very staunch acceptance of real reality. So optimism certainly is important when it comes to resilience, but unrealistic optimism is something that resilient people say sometimes can get in our way, because I have just put myself into a place that when I'm realizing that I can't actually reach that unrealistic goal, maybe sets me backwards on my goal to being more resilient. So it's about being very realistic in my optimism. The second characteristic is purpose. So what we mean by purpose is that resilient people tend to have this very deep belief that life itself, all of life, has meaning that the characteristic that I might be needing to be a little bit more resilient on can't be my only focus. So truly resilient people understand that there's a bigger picture. The whole picture is far more important than just that individual piece. Now, it allows me to kind of step back and focus on that piece without getting overwhelmed by that individual piece. So purpose is the second characteristic. And then the third characteristic is called flexibility. So resilient people have this uncanny ability to improvise and to adjust to whatever is changing. There's that word that so many of us, we kind of shudder at, or we just don't like, which is change, right? But what really truly resilient people are able to do is to acknowledge that change is a part of life. We hear that all the time, right? There's a few things that we know are going to be certain in life, and change is one of them. So the better you can wrap your head around the fact that change is maybe not inevitable in everything, but it's going to happen, it allows you to be a little bit more resilient. So before we actually talk about how to become more resilient, let's talk about what it can actually do for you. Why is resilience so important? So the first bullet point I want to pull up on here is that resilience can lead to living a happy and healthy life. Key is that both of those words are important, is healthy and happy. So think about, how do we feel when we are living very positively? And I want you all to just take a quick 30 seconds and think about, when have you been the most positive? What does it feel like to be in that truly positive space for yourself? Those feelings would be great to be able to have consistently. So I would like to think that when we get more resilient, it allows us to lead that more healthy, happy life. We all know that stress is not healthy for us. So when we take stress out of the equation, it can certainly help us. Let's take a look at the second why that we've come up with. So, by not allowing the circumstances that we might be thinking that we need more resilience on to get the best of us, we can actually rise above the times and the trials and tribulations in our lives. It allows us to rise above, because if we go back to when we talked about earlier, purpose, right? That it's not just one circumstance in our life that is overwhelming us. It allows us to think about the bigger picture, which is everything that we have going on. We can actually manage that intensity of that one individual thing and allow our emotions to say to ourselves, okay, it's this one piece. How do I pull myself back to actually look at the bigger picture? And the third reason that we have for why resilience is actually important is that it empowers us to believe that we are not broken by our circumstances, and rather, again, looking at the bigger picture. Often, some of the things that we feel overwhelmed with, what happens is it takes on such a big piece of us that it then becomes bigger than the bigger picture of us too. So those are some good 3 whys, hopefully, that you all that see as a big reason why we'd want to work on our resilience. So let's move to how emotional intelligence works into play here. And I always like to, on our webinars, at least give a very high-level review of EQ. For those of you who have attended our webinars or know emotional intelligence, quick review. For those of you who are here for the first time, I just want to make sure that we keep you on the same page with us here. So our definition here at Talent Smart of emotional intelligence is that it is your ability to recognize and understand your emotions, and it's your ability to use that recognition and that understanding of how to manage it within ourselves. Within emotional intelligence, there are 4 key skills. So 2 of those are personal competences, self-awareness and self-management. So that's the me part of it. And then the other 2 skills are social awareness and relationship management. Those are the social competence, what we're looking at with other people as well. The interesting thing about emotional intelligence is the 4 skills, again, that we can work on and develop, they're pretty much all at play at the same time, but it doesn't feel that way a lot of times. What it feels like is I'm working on one, but a lot of times if I'm working on self-managing, it's because I've noticed something from a social awareness perspective or from a relationship that I'm trying to manage as well. So they all affect each other. We probably feel like we're working on one at a time. I think what's interesting about this is how we're going to connect it, because you can connect emotional intelligence to so many different skills out there you're trying to work on. But since we're working on resilience, I want to remind us of the 3 characteristics that we're going to attach a few different strategies to. So I want to work and look at each of acceptance, purpose, and flexibility so that we can attach a specific strategy to each. So let's talk first about acceptance. And let's make sure that we are all on the same page with what we mean by acceptance. So more specifically, we're talking about having this acceptance of reality. And I said before, it's about understanding what is unrealistic so that we are at least trying to approach this from a more achievable state. Resilient people have said that when I go too far and it is completely out of possibility, I might trick myself to thinking, well, I'm not going to be able to achieve that, so I'm not even going to go there. So think about it more from a very realistic situation that we can be in the acceptance part. And if we have an unrealistic view, sometimes it makes us stop. So let's talk about a strategy that we would suggest for acceptance. So our suggestion here is to look at get to know yourself under stress. I think that we all know what stress feels like in ourselves, but it's important to do that if you don't. Here's some suggestions for you when you're trying to figure out what it feels like for me. When I am in a stressful mode, if something has all of a sudden triggered me to be stressful, at a point in time after you're able to gather yourself, it is a great idea to take some notes and mark it down as to what was that feeling? How did I feel? What was I thinking? What was I wanting to say or do during that time of stress? Here's why that's helpful is because then the next time that feeling, those emotions come on, I can be better prepared to understand that I'm actually in a stressful mode here. When you feel stress and then you pause, it should give you an opportunity to then manage what's going to come out of you so that getting to know yourself out of stress, at least at the beginning, allows you to be better prepared. So that's kind of like that self-awareness, right? The self-awareness part is get to know myself under stress so that it helps me be better when I'm trying to self-manage myself. Let's think about it currently, right? I'll bring up what many of us are probably still going through, and that is the hybrid work situation. And we have probably heard in the past maybe year plus different options at our own work as to what hybrid was going to look like. And so maybe at the beginning of the summer of 2021, an organization said, hey, listen, we're all going to come back to the office just a couple of days a week. But then what happened was that changed at the end of the summer. And then it moved into 1 day a week. And then maybe at Christmas time, I heard many people tell me, well, then all of a sudden, right after Christmas, we were back there 3 days a week. So a lot of changes that were happening. This was causing stress for some people because it was making a difference in daycare, or it was making a difference in how maybe you and the other people in your house were using cars or transportation. Whatever reason it was causing stress for, if I step back for a moment to understand what is causing me stress, but then looked at it from an acceptance standpoint to say to myself, what's realistic that I should be stressed out about and maybe what I shouldn't be stressed out, helps you to pull back for a little bit to be able to maybe say to yourself, okay, that is not worth me being very stressful. I like this particular strategy because I get to make the decision. I don't get to ask anybody else what they think I feel like or look like under stress, because you're the only one that can actually feel it. And it is very fair for you to feel stressful when something comes up that may not make somebody else stressed out. Your reason for being stressed is probably very different than somebody else's. So get to know yourself under stress. Do yourself a favor with that. So let's take a look at the next characteristic that we mentioned earlier, and that was purpose. Again, we're talking about, regarding people and, the realistic characteristic of having this deep-seated belief that it is more than my circumstance that I'm being stressed out about or need to be more resilient about. It is about my whole picture here. So let's talk about the strategy that we would like to connect with purpose. And that is to visit your values. So you might be thinking, well, what would that have to do with anything? So it's really understanding your core beliefs, like what matters to you. Here's why I would connect this with purpose is when I know what I stand for, what matters to me, what are my priorities, and then I look at what might be the stressor for me or the piece that I feel like I need to be more resilient on, and I notice that those don't align, I should be able to pull back to say, okay, I think I'm putting a little too much energy on this particular item that should not be nearly as high priority on my list. So visiting your values allows you to say, what is it that I stand for? what should I really care about in the grand scheme of me, not on anybody else? And when I look at, let's go back to the hybrid situation. Maybe for you, in the grand scheme of things, you don't care how many days you're at home. You just want to be home for a couple of days a week because you've gotten very used to it and you've been able to maybe put some projects at home into play while you're working. But it allows you then to this time, instead of stressing out about it, you might be able to say, okay, I'm going to put this on the not stress list because whatever ends up being is going to be okay for me. Visiting your values allows you to focus your energy in the right place. You know, the past several years have probably made us feel like we needed to focus on more things than we needed to be. But when you start paying attention to the things that really matter to you, you might find that list of really stressing me out and really not stressing me out goes more like this because you realize it's not part of my values and I need to take it off of that list. So the third characteristic that we mentioned earlier is about flexibility. You know, people who are truly resilient, they do have an uncanny ability to just bounce back. And, you know, we've all seen those people where some change maybe comes into place and they're like, okay, that's what we need to do. And you think to yourself, how on earth did they do that so quickly? Well, they have built this particular part of their skill of resilience, of being flexible to say, okay, change is going to come. So this is what I would suggest from a strategy for flexibility is accept the change that's around the corner. And that sounds simple and easy sometimes, but it may not be for every single thing. But go back just for another second here to talk about the hybrid situation. That has been something that has ebbed and flowed for so many of us that work in the corporate world or anywhere where office versus home has been happening. So if I keep seeing change, maybe it's time to accept that that change is going to continue to happen and take it off of your shoulders from being stressed out about it. Know that change is around the corner again, potentially. And then when it doesn't change, how happy might you be for that? You know, if you're in one of the companies that have seen multiple adjustments, and I facilitate classes for Talent Smart all over the world, mostly virtual, but we have definitely been out in person. And I have certainly seen how companies have said, when I ask, what is your work program right now? Sometimes I will get an eye roll from people and say, well, this week it's this. And I think it's changing on August 1st to that. So instead of that letting it get to you, a really great rule of thumb is to let that roll off and say, okay, I'm going to let that just be a change that's coming. Here's the other way that you could look at this too is, what is it that you control and what is it that you don't control? Because some of the changes you might be able to share ideas or thoughts on or make strong recommendations as to why you believe maybe something could be a certain way. But if you are not the decision maker, then take the stress off of you, knowing that that part of the change is not your responsibility. It might be something you'd like to be able to make a decision, but if you're not in the decision-making role, take it off of your shoulders and allow yourself to say, all right, I have shared my piece, I've made my suggestions, and I have asked individuals to at least consider my point of view. But whatever the change is going to happen next, I better be ready for that. And then it allows you to then, when it happens, to be better prepared for that. All right, so sort of lied at the beginning, I said I had 3 strategies for you. I actually have a bonus strategy because as I was looking at our webinar for today, I thought, you know what? This particular one fits all 3 of the characteristics that we talked about of being of acceptance, of purpose, and of flexibility. And that one is focus your attention on your freedoms rather than your limitations. So let's talk about what we mean by that. So one last time, I will go ahead and talk about the hybrid situation, right? So perhaps the direction is I have to be in the office 3 days a week. So my freedoms might be that I get to pick which 3 days. It might be my freedoms are that I get to come in whatever time I want to on that day, at least as long as I'm there by 9, or as long as I'm putting in an 8-hour day, or maybe those are my freedoms. So understand and ask the clarifying questions. What are my guardrails? Your freedoms become what's between the guardrails. My limitations become sort of, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, in that I'm not the decision maker, perhaps. Now, if I am a decision maker, then my limitations might be far less. But understand what your limitations are. And this goes for everything in the acceptance characteristic, the purpose characteristic, and the flexibility characteristic. It allows me to give myself and cut myself a break sometimes. Because if I can't make the decision on something, then this strategy helps you with actually stepping back and say, okay, I can't control that. And when I know those, it really does make you a little bit, almost gives you a sigh of relief. It allows you to take a deep breath, and it allows you to say, all right, what do I control? What do I not control? You get to focus on that while other people focus on, sometimes it's that decision making. So those are the 4 strategies that we would recommend to help you working on your resilience. I know we've been having questions coming in throughout the session. We're at about that half-hour mark. So Madison, I'm gonna let you go ahead and post some questions. What do we have out there? I'd love to hear what everybody's got.
Of course, David. Yeah, we had some really great questions come in, so I'm glad we have a lot of time to go through these. So one of our first questions from the audience, one might know thyself, but not be able to control thyself. How do you strategize that?
Well, say that one more time because that was really great.
One might know thyself,
Yep.
but not be able to control thyself. How do you strategize that?
Perfect. Thank you. Whoever asked that question, great question. So it does start when you think about emotional intelligence, self-awareness. So if you're saying that I do know myself, now you get to put that into action. And so what I mean by that is that self-management is what comes next for you. Is the more self-aware that I am, I need to be able to give myself a moment. Sometimes it's that count to 10 or take a breath or step away and say, now that I know this, what do I need to do about it? I'll give you an example for that. So let's just say that you do realize that every time, I'm going to just use the hybrid situation since I've been talking about that, you know that every couple of weeks, leadership comes up with a new plan, and it is just stressing you out. So if I know that that's what's stressing me out, what I could do for myself from a self-management standpoint is actually be very planful to say, it's going to happen again, so don't get myself upset. I know that sounds simple to say that to myself, but when I do put that piece, those words into my head, it does allow you to be better prepared to respond to whatever does come up. Because here's the other nice thing is if it's a surprise and it doesn't happen, then automatically you're like, okay, I was prepared and I'm all good. But take what you do know about yourself from the self-awareness perspective and turn it into action, because that's really what managing yourself is all about, is now that I know this, let me be the one that takes control of how I actually either say something or do something and make it be more effective for you so that it doesn't come out of my mouth if it shouldn't come out of my mouth, and that I just rephrase something so that I am better off for it. Great question, thanks.
Thanks, David. So we'll move on to our next one. How long does it take to build your resilience, in your opinion?
Cool. So that's probably a great question to have, because when we think about emotional intelligence, we know that it takes a little bit of time with practice to change. So I'm going to say that it's going to be the same thing with resilience, meaning that I can't just think that I can latch onto one of the strategies, attempt it one time, and if it doesn't work for me, say, well, that didn't work. What we have learned through emotional intelligence and through all of the people who have gone through our programs and our assessments, we have learned that it takes probably a good 9 months to fully change a behavior that way. But I certainly have seen in many of the aspects that I've been working with people around the globe on emotional intelligence is that when I give consistent practice, I might get that switch over sooner than later. So I think the big key here is don't give up. So try a strategy that's that you like, for instance, and try it more than once, more than twice, and even more than 3 times, so that you practice it enough times in order to be able to see how you make it work for you. Sometimes some of these strategies sound really great and you think, well, this is how it's going to go. But then what happens is you try it and you thought, wow, that's not really working for me. A best rule of thumb that I always recommend to people is ask some other people, I like this strategy, at least from a content perspective. How do you think it would actually work? You know, one of the little activities that I do in a program at the end when I'm asking people to decide what strategy they want to work on to improve their emotional intelligence is we now in my classes walk around and talk to people and say, how do you see this working? How do you see this working? And the amount of input that you get from other people's perspectives is quite sometimes life-changing because people hear something and say, never looked at it that way. So whatever strategy you might like from these that you've seen, allow yourself to practice it several times. And I think what you'll find is that you're going to be able to improve your resilience much quicker when you latch onto something that you can trust and keep working on than if you just try it once or twice and say, well, that didn't work for me. So keep at it. And I think you're going to find it happen quicker than later.
Thanks, David.
Yep, thanks for that question.
When you spoke about acceptance, you said that optimism could get in the way of being resilient. I'm a pretty optimistic person. So are you saying that any and all optimism can get in the way of being more resilient?
Oh, wow. So thank you for asking the clarification. I'm glad you asked it. So no, absolutely not. What we have seen in the studies that I've read about people who are resilient is that it is the unrealistic optimism. Being optimistic is clearly important and very helpful in anybody who wants to truly be more resilient. What I've read in a lot of these is that when people say, I just set the bar to a place that I knew was unreachable to start off with, and so I set myself into a place that I was getting disappointed with myself. And what I wasn't doing was actually even working on steps. Because I'd like to think about how do I work on anything, right? When I'm building a skill. So an emotional intelligence skill, resilience skill, take it step by step. Don't try and jump from here's where I am and I'm going to just jump to the top. Later on, as you achieve each of these steps, being even more optimistic about what you think is possible certainly helps. So being optimistic, very helpful. But don't put yourself into that place of being so outlandishly unrealistic optimism that you then stop even trying before you get there. So that's really what we meant there. So thanks for asking the question. Glad you're optimistic. We need optimism whenever we are trying to be resilient, quite frankly.
We have another audience member. Another audience member was curious if you could share a bit more about the strategy you mentioned for purpose, visiting your values.
Ooh, yeah, certainly. So I really like this one because I'm going to share with you an example for me how I use this. There are times, and I'm going to go, the last few years have certainly challenged us in many, many ways. And not the same for all of us, right? Because we've had a lot of things going on in the world, here in the United States, in your own communities, that have made us need to be more resilient. And I think what has happened is that each little individual piece of the puzzle has seemed like a much bigger piece of the puzzle than it needed to be. Here's what I started doing, because I found myself to be stressed about tons of things. So I decided to visit my values by doing this. I made a list of everything that was stressing me out and things that were driving me crazy, insane. And as I made this list, I then decided to visit the values, my own values, knowing what I stand for, what matters, what my priorities are. And what I did was I looked at my list of stressors and I said, does that fit there? And when I noticed something that I was like, why do I care about that? I moved it out of my stress list and I put it in the I don't care list, because I knew that it was still a stressor, and what I needed to do with the items, I was actually moving over to the side that I really shouldn't care about this as much as the other pieces. It allowed me to not focus on those things. So here's what I was doing before is I was reading articles and watching news programs on things that were stressing me out that were not part of my values, things that I really cared about, but really for my being were not as important as some of the others. I was able to get my stress list, if you will, down to a very manageable list. So I could then start looking at those items to say, okay, these do really matter. This is what I'm going to pay attention to, and see then what is it I can do about them. Because that list that then was over here that said, don't be stressed about it because they're not part of really who you are or you really necessarily need to worry about right now. That allowed me to honestly take an Excel. So I love visiting your values so that you allow yourself to say, okay, if they don't matter to me, take them off of my list. Thanks for the question. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, David. You actually answered our next audience question at the end of that. Someone did ask, what happens in the opposite case when the values intersect with what you are stressed about? So if you want to touch on that a little bit more, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great follow-up question because, when I do realize that my values are what I'm stressed about, I get to now focus on those. And what I mean by focus is take a look at each one individually and say, and we'll go back to one of the strategies to say, what is it that I can do about it? What do I own? What can I do? And what don't I own? So that it allows me to then set myself up to say, okay, so maybe I can do 1, 2, 3 things about this. But here's the thing that I can't do. Maybe I don't make decisions about it, or maybe I don't have a contact about something that I'm stressed out about. But there might be some other things that I can do. So if you look at this hopefully reduced list, the intersection is telling you why is it important to you, and now worry about, and not worry, let's take that word out of it, focus on the piece that you can control. That's where I would actually say that intersection really works well for you.
Thank you, David.
Absolutely.
So one more question. Do
Sure.
you have another example of the very last strategy you shared, the bonus strategy about focusing on your freedoms rather than your limitations?
Oh, great question. Yes, I actually do have one. So here's a great way of thinking about this. Let's say that you work in an organization and you have a lot of great ideas and you're bringing them to the table, whether it's with your leader, with your peers, with whoever else, and maybe many, all, whatever of those are not being picked up, and it is frustrating you and making you stressed out. This kind of goes back again to the whole piece of focus on what you can do and as opposed to your limitations, because I see that as an example of I can bring all the ideas to the table. I can even share the reasons I'm bringing this to the table. Maybe it's I know this works. I've seen it work. I have studies on this or something of that. But if you ultimately are not the person who's going to make the decision on whether they get instituted or not, that's the part that's probably frustrating. And so it can be a place for you to be able to go right back to that and say, all right, so this is not mine. What's mine is coming up with ideas. It's presenting them as well, because I do think that sometimes we come up with great ideas in our head, but we never voice them. And we've thought that we've gone as far as we need to go. But I would like to recommend that if you are an idea person, bring the ideas to the table, sketch them out, bring them to whoever it is needs to hear them. But if you know that that's as far as it can go, and you can even push a little bit with saying, have we thought about this? Do we want to have another conversation? Understand that your freedom is coming up with great ideas, bring it to the right people, sketching it out. But your limitation is in initiating it into the plan. That's tough sometimes for some of us who are thinkers and outside the box people. But when you put it into perspective and actually say, okay, there is not something I can actually do about this, it should allow you to take that deep breath and come back and say, hey, good for me. I brought some new ideas to the table. And who knows, down the road, it might be something that people will look at again and want to have a conversation about. But at the moment, it might just be that thing that is just not the priority. And you may not even know that it isn't the priority because you see it as that. So I think that's a good example and just like another reason to think about, use your freedoms, use all of them, but do understand where is your limitation there. Another
Awesome,
great question.
David.
Thanks, guys.
So we are coming up on time here, but we do have 2 questions left that I want to cover before we get into some last minute items.
Sure.
They are both on flexibility, so I'm going to give you both of them together. I think
Okay.
you can answer them well. So one person asked for tips on being more flexible. I find this very difficult, especially at work and dealing with change. And then the second person asked, what are some small things I can do to be more comfortable with change?
Ooh, great. I'm just writing that down so I make sure I did. Great question. So, change is one of those things that everybody wants us to be comfortable with, right? But the reality is it depends on the change. So I think one of the small ways to be more flexible and accept change is ask a lot of questions up front. One of the things that I learned in my career before Talent Smart, when I worked in the corporate world and started seeing why people were having such a challenge with change, was because people didn't understand sometimes what the change fully was. And the other thing they didn't understand is why it was happening. So if you are not getting that information, it is very valid for you to ask those questions. Could I just understand what's it really going to look like in the end? So here's where we are now. What's it look like whenever change is fully initiated? But could I even get some of the whys? Here's the thing I say constantly to adults is that we as adults need to know why. I may not like why. So that's the part that we need to move past. Adults are always inquisitive as to why it's happening. So if you're a leader, it is your responsibility to tell people, here's why it's happening. If you are the person who's receiving it, it's your responsibility to at least ask enough questions to be able to then understand the why, so you can then start to move your change meter, up that curve that says, okay, I might be at a little bit of a resistance right now, but I'm going to continue to think about this. And maybe I start seeing why other people are accepting the change. That's another small thing that you can do is when you see somebody else accepting or embracing change, ask them very simply, how'd you get past that? What is it that you heard that maybe I did not hear? It allows you then to be more flexible when you start saying, I had not thought about it from that perspective. Because a lot of times, change that's happening, if it directly affects us, we go to the personal of that. So I would just challenge us all to ask enough questions so that we can start figuring out, what else do I need to know to be comfortable with this, especially if change on this particular topic is inevitable. So that would be my biggest advice. Ask questions on the what is it going to look like, why is it happening, and talk to the people who you see are maybe a little bit more like early adapters or people who are coming along and understanding what's happening. Great questions. Thanks for putting those together too, Madison.
Yeah, David, thank you so much for answering all of those questions and for guiding us through the discussion today. I do have to tell you that we've had a lot of praise come in through the comment section on your content and delivery. So great job and
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate that.
And I want to thank everyone who joined us today and let you know that the July webinar topic will be EQ and law enforcement. It is going to be on July 14th at 10 a.m. Pacific time and 1 p.m. Eastern time. That is a Thursday. For the webinar, we will be having our Executive Vice President of Programs, Sue DeLazaro, as our subject matter expert. I hope you'll join us then, and thank you again. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your days, your evenings, and we hope to see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.